My name is Ben Jeanette, and I'm a training coordinator with the National Center for School Safety, and this is the Illuminating Insights into School Threat Assessment Toolkit series. In this video conversation, we are joined by Joey Melvin, the Executive Director of Delaware's School Safety Center, to discuss the importance of law enforcement involvement in school threat assessment. Thank you for being here today to share your expertise. Can you take a moment and introduce yourself to our audience?
Of course, I'm Joey Melvin. I'm serve as the executive director of Delaware School Safety Center with the Delaware Emergency Management Agency.
Thank you. We know that most threats can be addressed by school staff, but there are situations where law enforcement involvement is necessary. The School Threat Assessment Toolkit recommends including a trained officer, such as a school resource officer or SRO, on the threat assessment team to provide that legal expertise and assist with investigations when needed, and also help build positive relationships between schools and the community. However, not every school has an SRO. In those cases, what steps can schools take to build strong partnerships and involve law enforcement effectively in their threat assessment process?
Yeah, you touched on relationships, which is extremely important. And for many schools, I would say almost the majority don't have a contracted school resource officer on site. So when they don't have that, it's still important to have really what I refer to as some type of liaison. So having a liaison from law enforcement that is covering the jurisdiction in which your school is housed is extremely important. Best way to kind of do that is, again, building that rapport with that jurisdiction. That could be a local municipality, that could be state police or sheriff's department, and the school should really be proactive, reach out to them, introduce themselves. They should be meeting anyhow in the emergency operations planning, but this part is extremely important. Explain to them what processes the school has in place. Explain to them they'd like to have someone that could be a point of contact, ideally someone that's available 24/7. And I understand that can be difficult, but explain what behavioral threat assessment is, explain the importance of that law enforcement lens to them, and really get that buy-in from that agency.
Um, with that involvement with law enforcement, how should they be involved in the different stages of a threat assessment?
Yeah, there's a lot of variability depending on the type of threat, the type of information. We may not even have a threat. Often we refer to concerning behaviors. And as soon as you have that process, finding a way to really get them involved, particularly when it reaches a level of uncertainty or any kind of safety concern. Better to reach out more often when in doubt than to not. Having that lens, and we've seen it through countless cases in the past, excluding the lens of law enforcement can be detrimental to both the people involved, potential incidents in the future. So finding a way to get them involved as soon as you can, if anything, if it's via phone, if they can't make it to a meeting, keeping them informed about what you're dealing with, seeing what resources they have that they can apply to it.
I think that's great, reaching out to law enforcement to see their resources. With those resources, how should law enforcement be actually involved in the various stages of the actual threat assessment? What should they bring to the table?
Right. So when they're there, they're looking through a couple different lenses. Um, First and foremost, they're law enforcement. So they're looking, did a crime occur? So as the information and the intelligence is gathered about the situation and the teams sharing what they know, that law enforcement officer is applying that lens, thinking about, do we have a crime that occurred or the potential for a crime to occur? Again, they're looking through that safety lens. So even though they don't have a crime per se, safety still involved. So when mental health gets involved, there'll be times sometimes that they lean on their law enforcement partners, depending on how serious the case is. It could be a case where the law enforcement officer actually detains an individual to take them to get mental health services. Again, not a crime, but that falls under the purview for law enforcement to keep people safe. At other times, when they're sitting across the table and they're having discussions, it could be that a student that is of concern can't be located or not at school. And that's where the resources really come into play, where that law enforcement officer can reach out to patrol another jurisdiction, ask for them to respond to the student of concern's house, do a welfare check of that person. All the external investigatory issues could be handled and supported by that law enforcement officer. So that's really important for them to kind of apply that, again, in conjunction with, did a crime occur?
Yeah, and with that idea of whether they're deciding whether a crime occurred or not, what should school administrators understand about the differences between a school's threat assessment process and any criminal investigation pertaining to the incident?
They are separate processes, right? So helping them understand that, traditionally in the past, especially before behavioral threat assessment was even a practice, many times when law enforcement showed up, it was, all right, now it's your turn to take over, and we're going to go back to looking at our educational uh, uh, institution and what we're supposed to be doing. But the truth is, especially what we've learned, is it doesn't stop there. So as law enforcement does their parallel investigation to look if there's a crime occurred, the safety issues, the school is also continuing to conduct their investigation, school discipline, right, mental health and resources in that manner. Also, there's interconnections between how that safety plan can be created with both parties. So that plan meets, or that team meets, they discuss. Law enforcement, for them to conduct searches, they require probable cause or consent. Schools, on the other hand, many times fall under case law that provides them just reasonable suspicion. So if they're concerned about a student, they have every right to go search the student, search a locker, search a car, search a backpack. I think for both working together, especially before an incident occurs, so they understand what their roles should be, is really important. There's going to be times where the administrator wants to conduct a search, but the intelligence that's gathered could be cause for alarm if it could be a weapon involved. And at that point, that's really where they should be leaning on their law enforcement partners to say, hey, while I can conduct a search, I'm worried about safety, and kind of make them an agent of them to support them in that search and keep everybody safe.
That's great. And you've touched base on this a little bit, the idea of searching. This is an area that often raises questions during a threat assessment, is how to handle those student belongings and personal searches. What guidance should school administrators follow regarding when and by whom students and their items such as backpacks and lockers should be searched?
Yeah, again, getting that involvement on the front end is really important because respectfully, when we bring the people to the table for behavioral threat assessment, your administrator and their lens, they're looking at, did a disciplinary incident occur, right? Dealing with parents. Your mental health counselors are looking at the mental health of that student and the rest of the population. So bringing that other lens there again when it comes to searches is really important. And we've seen cases where schools that have had school resource officers assigned to the school excluded the SRO during their investigation and had really terrible incidents occur after, only to find out that there was a weapon in the backpack. So adding that lens to that multidisciplinary team can help provide, especially on the front end, that training together to say, hey, we have these situations. What are we going to do? And talk about that. I really encourage tabletop exercise all of these different scenarios, especially the really bad scenarios that we had. Take those real incidents, put it in front of that team, and everyone talk about what their role should be, the missed opportunities, and how we're not going to let that happen here because we're going to plan it out and know ahead of time. Many of the incidents that we've seen have come from lack of preparation, where they're in the moment, they're in the incident, they're overwhelmed, they've never thought about it before, and mistakes get made.
That's such a great idea to include tabletop exercises with your team so that way you kind of have that idea of how to run down those different situations. Is there anything further you'd like to add or emphasize that we haven't touched on today?
Now, I just would really want to reiterate that, having the behavioral threat assessment team for many seems like it may be burdensome for those thinking about doing it. I've implemented in many districts, large and small, and I've not had a district as of yet that have come back and said this is too much for us to kind of handle. It's developing that process, Really want to reiterate encouraging the training and education part. Make sure that also includes those law enforcement partners. Many times you may invite a law enforcement partner, and if you bring up the term behavioral threat assessment, may have no idea what you're talking about, and that's okay. Right? That's another gap that we continually try to fill. Invite them to your trainings, invite them to other trainings that you have. When you bring them to the table, you're probably going to be the educator and explain to them, hey, this is what this is, provide them guidance. And going back to that kind of tabletop, those are really easy to do. Take real life examples. The teams, if you can meet every month, if you've not had any incidents, perfect opportunity to spend 15 minutes running through a tabletop. Now you have a little bit of that foreseeability, and you've kind of been there before, preparing yourself for that. So I can't advocate for that enough.
Awesome. Well, again, appreciate you joining us today to talk about this topic of bringing law enforcement in on your threat assessments in the school process. Thank you again.
Yep.
Well, we again would like to thank Joy Melvin from the Delaware School Safety Center for joining us today about the involvement of law enforcement in your school threat assessment. If you'd like any further information about this, please refer back to the School Threat Assessment Toolkit on our website, nc2 the number s.org. Mr. Melvin brought up some key points about making sure that we have that open communication early on to make sure that there's an understanding with law enforcement of what each individual's role is in a situation where a threat assessment is being done and what the threat assessment process is for your school. And again, the idea of tabletop exercises to make sure that your school threat assessment team and law enforcement are able to work out those situations before they even happen to understand how to go about the process, especially if you haven't had a threat occur recently, and keep your team up to date on your policies and procedures. In this video, we talked about law enforcement's role in the threat assessment specifically, but we know that law enforcement can and should play a role in school safety generally. This can take several forms, including the presence of a dedicated school resource officer who builds positive relationships with students and staff. To learn more about SROs and school safety, check out the School Resource Officer video series on our website. It should also be said that if you do have a school resource officer at your school, they might fill the role of the law enforcement officer member on your threat assessment team, as they would have previous knowledge of the team's purpose, your school's policies, and the students and staff involved in the situation.